Yes.
My daughter lives here with me. She's a student down in Lewiston, which is about 30 miles south of here.
Ah, I didn't know that there was a college or a university in Lewiston.
Well, there is a state college, and she's in a baccalaureate nursing program there.
Ah,
Bless her. James just graduated with his RN degree from a accelerated RN program in Roseman, right next to Las Vegas in Henderson.
Oh, you were telling me that. Yeah. Where's he looking for work?
Well, he just is scheduled right now to take his board exams, and so he's right at the cusp of applying. I think he's met a wonderful young woman there. I mean, it has us all like with our fingers crossed, but I flew down for his graduation. It was a hoot. But anyway, she is New York, huge Italian family, gets him by the nose hairs, and it's like, yes, he needs a director. He does. Brilliant young man. But anyway, I think he'll try to work in Las Vegas for a couple of years until he wants emergency room is what he's aiming for. So that's a pretty prize.
Well, wish him well on the boards. You know, I worked extensively with the nursing program in Northern,
yes,
and that was always the big challenge.
He scored the highest of anyone in the University of Montana at the pre-nursing thing. It was like a 95%, and it was unheard of. And so he took his Roseman requires them to have a pre-test to adjudicate their success rate. They have to know that you're with 90% success rate is what they advertise. He got a 99.9% on his pre-test, so I suspect he'll do fine on the test. But it's if it's testing, fine. If it's going out and remembering to carry your damn letters of rec with you, then he needs a director.
Nursing's a good field to be in. It's a very good field to be in.
Judy, can I ask, were you a student of Mary's?
In some ways, in many ways, yes. She never was teaching at the University of Montana, but I was at Yellow Bay for a writers' conference one summer, and I studied with Mary and had a manuscript meeting at that point. And just because our stories were sort of linked in that they were both All But the Waltz and my early essays were all kind of stemming from the same area, she was, in a sense, breaking trail for me. She was... we got kind of thrown together in the same pot by a lot of people who said, oh, you must know, and they'd say to me, oh, you must know, and so of course I made it my personal pleasure to know everything she'd written, probably before I ever met her. So,
alrighty, folks, we're all up and running. I'm going to disappear and just kind of watch chat. I can bring in questions at the end, or I don't know if Diane, you'll be doing that. That's fine too, throughout. But I'll be in the background, and you guys people should be wandering in over the next few minutes.
All right. Well, welcome everybody from Dunrovin Ranch in Lowell, Montana. This is our third session of book club, Western Women's Book Club. Well, we had the introduction section.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. At our first session, we talked about Judy Blunt's book, and Judy is here to my left. Say hello, Judy.
Hi. Hello, Judy.
Hello, Judy. And on our Google groups, this is a new format that we were trying this time so that we can bring people in from afar. We have our online host, Diane Hoffman from Princeton, New Jersey. Wave hello, Diane. And then we have our guest author, Mary Clearman Blue. She's joining us from her home in Moscow, Idaho. Hi, Mary. Can you wave?
Hello.
And we will be discussing her book, All But the Waltz, this evening. And I'm going to start off by thanking you for this great book. I found a lot of my family in this book, Mary. My father's father family came up to Fort Benton in the 1860s and settled in the Belt Monarch Neihart area near the Big Belt Mountains. So it's not that far from where your family settled. And I recognized much of my own family in your descriptions of your family. And I think for me personally, it really brought up how place and people go together. And it made me wonder whether I would be the same person if I had been born elsewhere. It was that intertwining of family dynamics with the geography and with the day-to-day existences that take place in that place are all sort of melded together. And that, I thought you brought that out so beautifully in looking at your multiple generations. But we have had 2 chat sessions the last couple of weeks, and during those chat sessions, Diane summarized some of the questions that chatters were interested in your addressing. I emailed those to you. I don't know if you have them in front of you or not. But
yes, actually I do. Yes, I do.
Well, very good. Why don't we have Diane just start off the conversation with the first one of those questions then, if you wouldn't mind, Diane. You're muted, Diane. Here.
Now I'm not muted.
Yes, there you go.
It's such an unusual thing for me to be muted, let me tell you. Actually, I was very interested in the structure of your book. The fact that it seemed very just an odd assortment of essays until you suddenly brought it all together at the end. Was that your intent, to show all one family, or just to write separate stories that could be written as read autonomously as separate stories?
When I started, this was the first, my first foray into nonfiction, creative nonfiction. I'd never tried it before, and I began writing standalone pieces. And they're not. I did not write them in the order that they are. That you'll find them in the book. And one of my tasks, once I got the essays together, was to go out and to go through it and do a lot of cutting. Explanation that was necessary if the essay were to be published separately, but was just boring if you read it for the 3rd or 4th time. The first piece I was working on, the first piece I finished was a piece about my father's death. I think it's called Dirt Roads. And the 2 last pieces that I wrote were the initial piece, The Sow and the River, and the last piece, All But the Waltz. And the others, I couldn't tell you now just in what particular order they were written. I think the one about my grandmother going out to teach in a country school was one of the early ones. So no, I had no thought of writing a sustained narrative when I started. And in fact, it's kind of, I think, a direction I often take. I'm not sure where I'm going, and the very act of writing is an act of discovery for me, of working through my own feelings and my own impulses, and asking myself what it is that I'm thinking about.
Well, that explains a great deal about the tone of the book, because it's pretty even over most of the chapters, but it changes quite a bit. Am I still muted?
No. Are you thinking of possibly that last essay about my husband's death?
Yes.
Yeah, and as I said, that was one of the last ones that I wrote, and it was one that was, of course, the closest to me in time at that time. Yeah. He died in the fall of 1987. We'd been separated for a couple of years before that, and I probably wrote the essay in about 88 or 89, and so it was still pretty raw. And the conventional wisdom of that among others, writing instructors like me, tell students is many times it's a good idea to get some distance. Many times it's a good idea to let traumatic events pass and give yourself some time before you return to them. But in that case and in some other things I've written, that's not the case. And so it was painful to write. I think it is probably closer to the bone in many ways. And yet the essay about my father's death, that was very painful.
That was
because
very, yeah.
it was so mysterious. And my sisters and I couldn't understand it. And it took a long time for me to realize that I was never going to understand it, that I would never know. And I was going to have to learn to live with never knowing exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
This conversation is prompting a question in my mind, Mary, and we have two authors here, so I want to ask it. In rereading your own book and looking at your own words describing events, when you set it aside for several years and come back to it, what's that like? I mean, the struggle of putting all of this together in a nonfiction way, a creative nonfiction way, like with your husband's death, and you were raw at the time that you wrote it, and then years have passed, and I'm sure that feelings evolve and perspectives evolve. So how does that work with an author who sort of committed themselves to something?
Well, for me, as I say, it was very difficult to write a couple of those essays. I got the seed of the essay about my father's death, for example, at a conference in Helena, Montana, that the Montana Committee for the Humanities had sponsored on Montana mythology. I forget exactly the name of the Sacred Stories, Sacred Cows. And I had written up just a skeleton of what I knew about my father's death, and it was really difficult for me to deliver it. It was difficult for me to write the essay about my husband, but I have since then read aloud to audiences both those pieces without feeling much of anything except the need to deliver them well. Mm-hmm. It's as though it happened to somebody else. Well, and that's not exactly right, because I recall reading aloud from Onyx Smith's fine essay about her husband's death in front of a creative writing class, and realizing I didn't think I was going to make it through it. It was moving me to tears, and in a way that my own writing no longer did. And what I take from that is that while writing is always therapeutic in some respects, one of the things that it does is to alter the way you feel and the way you recall the experience. It changes it in some subtle way. And sometimes, and I caution students, sometimes you don't want to change. Sometimes that's a reason not to write. Mm-hmm. But I have found that it's a way, the writing in itself is a way of distancing myself. And it's not something I've done deliberately.
It's the way of framing a memory in some way.
I suppose so. I suppose that's another way of putting it. It's a way of developing a narrative, if you like. It's mm-hmm. It's a way of making a story out of it. Mm-hmm. What was not originally a story, but a sequence of events, some of which are related to the story that I find in it, and some of which aren't.
Well, and there's the meaning part of that the series of events is not a surprise, but oftentimes when we begin writing, what comes of it can surprise us. And oftentimes those moments are a way of sort of coming to understand what we know about a certain series of events, mm-hmm. or coming to sort of resolve what we understand about a parent or about a grandparent or a spouse, or it doesn't fix anything, at least in my experience, but what it does is kind of solidify things. Writing about your life, I think, is a good practice because it allows you to study it. And they say that your unexamined life is better than an unexamined one.
Some of us must have great ones. We've done enough examining.
I know. I know.
I just taught an essay.
Pardon?
I just taught an essay by Anders Munson called "The Essay is Hack," in which he compares the personal essay with a computer hacker. You're digging into your own mind because you want to find out what's there, just as you might hack into somebody's bank account more to see if you can do it and what you'll find necessarily than to rob them. I'm sure
open to surprises, is that?
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on that whole concept of writing something down, in the sense that the written word has so much more weight than the spoken word, in part because you get to edit your own thoughts, and that's where you sort of dig in or hack, because you lay it out there and then you look at it and you read it and you think, is that really what I meant to say? Is that really what I'm trying to capture? And that process has got to somehow start to distill those essences or those meanings, those relationships and those places. And
I think it challenges writers to come across honestly, to actually bow to honesty, rather than talking to yourself and saying, is this how I want to appear to readers?
Yeah.
Is this how I want others to see me? Which is kind of what can sometimes happen as well. You don't want the way readers see you to be inaccurate, and the way you cast details, the way you bring people into a conversation or shunt them out can change how the story sounds to outsiders. And so being just aware of the craft elements of memoir, I think makes a huge difference in how we approach our stories. If we're writing for our own edification, sitting there free writing on some element or some event or some memory, it's a totally different thing for me than when I am forming something or reconstructing something for a purpose, for a publication, or to fit in with a segmented essay, or at that point I become much more of a hacker, much more of a intellectualized person who's viewing these three events and saying which is the strongest way to lead into that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Probably in second.
One of the things that I hear when you discuss that is the difference between free writing and revision. And I revise and revise and revise.
See, and I tend to write exactly the opposite. I sit there and I'm stalled on a sentence for 2 days, and then when that sentence is nailed into the ground, I start on the second one, and I can write a page a day and feel like having a fifth of whiskey behind it. It's just a huge accomplishment for me. But at the end of it, I sent Breaking Clean to the publishers, and it came back with 24 sticky notes. And that was 24 suggested changes, most of which were expand this or standardize the reference to First Creek Community Hall or whatever. But it meant that I had put my revision time in on the front end of it, and I think there just are two different kinds of writers. Uh-huh. I think some people blow it all out and then sift and seine and revise and restructure, and they've got everything on the page, and it becomes a knack of understanding how to pull things together from what you have. And the rest of us are extruders. We're like a pasta machine, and I don't think one is bad or one is better. They're just very different. I recognize them in my own students. The massive first drafters, I tell them, you're asking us to find the cup of gravy in the cesspool. You've turned in a 10-page essay in 45 pages. What are we to do with this? But then there are the others who just are like plugging through 3 pages, and they're exquisite, but they're not done yet. It's awesome.
Mary, I think that Diane, I think you are muted again. You might want to check to make sure you're not, and unmute yourself. There you go.
I am muted so that I don't interrupt the picture.
Oh, okay, fine, good. That's great. Well, let's go on to the next question that you had noted then, Diane.
Uh-huh. Mary, actually, this was interesting to me. Did you have any intention to about preserving or reforming the culture that you were describing?
Well, I think I have some interest in making a record, in telling a story of how it was, which doesn't seem that distant to me. Seems like another world to my daughters and my grandchildren, and so I'm interested in just preserving some sort of account of what it was and how it has shaped me, and how I think it's shaped a lot of Westerners. But I'm not. I have no missionary spirit. I'm not. I don't. I have no confidence in changing the culture. The culture will evolve, I suppose, in one way or another, just as we have. But I've been more interested in the record. I was at a conference where I heard Patricia Limerick said she had gotten over her finger shaking phase, and where she had scolded people and shaken her finger at them for their crazy ideas, and that seems to me a sign of growth.
I agree.
Well, and that's a very good outlook, and it sort of leads me to another question, because we had noticed and noted that when we were reading Judy's book and yours, the historical importance of storytelling. And do you think that such a wonderful book as yours could have been written without this strong tradition? And what does that imply for all of our generations to come?
Oh,
I mean, this is a wonderful story. I mean, this is terrific.
All kinds of changes. I will say my grandchildren enjoy hearing stories, and I do tell them stories. I don't have the time, nor do they, to follow me around the way I followed my grandmother around the ranch. I grew up in a place where there were so few distractions. I never saw television until I saw it on a trip back east, and I was in the 7th grade, and I never saw it regularly until, oh gosh, when I was in my 20s, I think. It just wasn't a part of my life. The phone was only a limited part of my life. I remember reading my aunt's diaries, and she was my mother's older sister who kept diaries all her life, and my oldest daughter said, I was reading the diaries and said I'd look to see how she reacted to the birth of all us kids, because she always was so welcoming, but she didn't say anything. And I said, well, what did you do? Look up your birthday? Yes. Well, nobody would have phoned. You have to go flip a few pages until the birth announcement had time to come in the mail. Now that makes a difference. And in this age of email and instant messaging and text messaging, everything is going to be altered. I understand the Japanese are writing cell phone text novels. I have to say I have not read one, and I believe that they're quite short, but this is certainly going to mean a change.
Well, this is like Charles Dickens writing for a newspaper.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Judy, do you want to comment on that? Because we made, your particular book really raised the question of storytelling and showed how important storytelling is to keeping family histories going.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a life without it, but I do know that the graduate students that I teach coming, into graduate programs oftentimes don't have any sort of oral tradition behind them. They have nothing that suggests storytelling other than what they have studied, which becomes a very different thing. The storytelling where I came from was a matter of community. It was a way of cementing relationships. It was a way of finding common elements. My mother, one time, she didn't fly very often, and when she did, it was all a matter of great nervous energy. She missed her flight, a layover in Salt Lake City, because a cowpoke came up to her, saw her wearing a hat and some turquoise, and started swapping yarns. She missed her flight. She totally spanned it out because they were telling stories. That can't be reproduced, I don't believe, in today's environment. It just pretty much isn't there.
Well, you know, people any other kind of entertainment, they would sit around the kitchen table by kerosene lamp, yes, and make stories out of their day. Yeah. And there was that, or I suppose listen to the radio till the batteries ran down.
Yeah. Well, we had electricity by the time I was old enough to be a viable witness to anything. Mm-hmm. 6, 7 years old. But even after that, the lessons of that community died hard, and so people still, not very many people had televisions, and they would get together to play cards. And so my parents would invite another couple. Many of the couples there didn't have children, were older, their kids had moved away, and so they'd come to play cards, and I'd scoot under the table between the feet and listen to the stories as they went around. It sounds cliche, but I mean, to me, it was the greatest adventure to listen to the way stories were told and to begin to understand by the couple, within a couple of years, of how the stories began to recycle or regenerate. The same stories were told, and people who had heard them before would begin to fill in parts of the story as they went along, and so they were embellished, and they evolved over time. They got better and better. Somebody would pitch in that must have been like a punchline of some sort that would then fuse itself to the story, mm-hmm, and it would get better as time went on. So
told over and over again.
Oh yeah,
the time Ron Colt drowned. Another thing that has destroyed that or lessened that sense of community are paved roads and consolidated schools.
Yes. It all becomes the same story.
That's frayed that sense of the small, close-knit community.
Yeah.
Well, a tribe.
I was just going to interject that in my own life, I have had the opportunity to be in very isolated circumstances with people I did not know. I was a researcher on vessels in Alaska, for example, and I can remember one 2-week period that we were holed up in a bay because the weather was so bad we could not move. And it was me and 5 men, and all we did was tell stories. And it was the most amazing. I was just thinking about that loss, because I would say that now they're probably all in their electronic gear, because with satellite communications, sure, they're communicating all over the world, and they are just probably more isolated than I was with these guys. Yes. A place called Old Harbor in the south of Kodiak Island, and that's all we had was playing poker and telling stories. And it was just, now that I think about it, it was a delightful way to get to know these people in a very different way.
Yes.
Very different way when you have all that time. You have to fill it with each other.
Well, and Mary can probably attest to the difference in the last 10 years even of students as they leave a classroom. I refuse to use the word exit, but as they leave the classroom, immediately begin swiping their handheld digital what's-a-madoobie, and they don't even look up. They'll walk. They seem to have radar, and they kind of avoid each other like bats on a but it's not. They don't interact. They don't meet eyes. They get to know each other online, and then they meet, but they don't run into each other on the quad.
Oh, I've told people that if I had done a Rip Van Winkle over 20 years and come back to our campus, I think everybody had an ear infection, because they all walk around with one hand lapped at the side of their heads.
We have a young man in the audience laughing. As he goes through his phone.
The cat on the couch agrees.
But you know, these are not all bad things. I just heard Melinda Gates interviewed to tell about the great things that portable technology does for the world.
Well, what we're doing today, I mean, I think it's quite remarkable that we are in different communities. We have people all over the United States watching and listening to you. And here you get to meet people, or they now have a sense of who the person was that wrote this book. And that really enriches. It certainly enriches my understanding of the book. And I really, I find it just wonderful to be able to get sort of behind the curtain. So the technology can, bring us together as well as split us apart.
Yes.
One of the things that I noted recently is my mother recently died, and when I was cleaning out her house, I found hundreds and hundreds of letters.
Yes.
And I wonder what's happening. And that's what sort of replaced the storytelling that did, was all of this letter writing that was done, which is no longer done. It's all a short email or 144 text characters.
My granddaughter and I have a pen pal arrangement going that we both fall short occasionally, but not responding in a timely manner. But rather than we Skype, we talk by phone occasionally. But I write letters to her, and part of it is to encourage her to read, of course. And I send her downloaded photos of the cat whom she's, adopted. And she scribbles letters back to me. She's a third grader, so they aren't incredibly expressive. But I think it is so important for young people to understand the basis of communication in the written word. And so much of text isn't about the writing. It's it's too immediate for that. There's no revision or review or thinking much beyond spelling YOU with a U and OK with a K, and yeah.
I found my own letters not long ago. For 3 years, my husband and I lived in Chile, and my father was very sick during those 3 years, and we couldn't even call home. So we were completely isolated from my parents, and all correspondence was through letters. And so I took it upon myself to write once a week to my father, and I am so grateful that, number one, I did that because I had to think of something interesting to say every week, and it was like having the camera in your hand. When I have a camera, I start to notice things, and the fact that I was going to write a letter to my dad that week meant I started noticing things, because I wanted to try to capture for him what I was experiencing, and in order to do that, I had to pay attention.
See, that's an awesome grasp of what it takes to be a writer. Notices, is aware, is alert to things going on around them in a different way.
A very different way. Yeah. I remember just recently I read one of my letters to him, which was all about the sounds of Santiago.
Wow.
And I took the whole week just sort of noting the sounds, the different sounds. I mean, there were horses with carts going on cobble streets. There was just, all the sounds were so different than Seattle, Washington. And, you get accustomed to them, and then I just think writing in itself opens your world.
I had a student a few years ago who discovered a packet of letters her mother had written to her when she was an undergraduate, and like many undergraduates, never had answered. And so as an adult, looking back, her mother by that time was dead, she began developing an essay in which she answered the letters.
Wow.
And it was a great idea.
Yeah.
I don't know how the project finally turned out, but she really was onto something there. Really a way to get an emotional and also carefully considered draft together that would tell her something about her relationship with her mother, and tell her readers something about that relationship.
just recently came across a Christmas card from my parents in the year between high school graduation and marriage, when apparently, according to this, what I would guess from this card, I had distanced myself from them pretty completely. And it was a typical Christmas card, and it just, no message, just love your parents, Clarence and Shirley Blunt, which was the term of formal address was like, message received.
Well, Mary, I'd like to go back to the comment I made when we were right before we went on air, and that is about the geography, the interplay between family and geography. I found it really fascinating, and in fact, I noted several passages, and one of them, which really struck me, was how I believe it was your grandfather. I don't remember the relationship now, but he was a surveyor.
No, my great-grandfather, yes.
Your great-grandfather. And you talked about, and I thought you distilled it so beautifully when you talked about the process of changing a landscape into property. That you were taking what was something that was a people's home and a landscape to the Plains Indians and turning it into individual properties. And I thought, yes, that's exactly what happened. Is that we took this ecological system and turned it into something different. So I would love to hear you talk about how much you felt the land was part of an integral part of your family's life and our story.
Well, one of the aspects of growing up the way I did on land where my family had lived for several generations was that every landmark had some kind of story attached to it. And there was the drop off where my cousin drove a team of horses. There was the river bend where the roan colt drowned. There was the old garden where my great grandmother had a garden. Every landmark was in some ways significant, and there was a direct tie to the way we felt about the land. And where I live now, I occasionally see road signs and so forth that suggest that for somebody somewhere, there are still those associations. There's a Lost Steer Road, for example. Somebody lost a critter there sometime, and it mattered enough that people called it that. And now everyone's forgotten why, or I suspect most people have forgotten why. But what these associations are, until I write about them, they're private. And no more than probably a dozen people, if that many people, know those things about that particular place in central Montana. As I understand it, Navajo culture ties the landscape to the religion. That here is where Changing Woman emerged. This butte is important because of this religious significance. In something of the same way that you may find it if you travel through Israel today. Here is where David fought a battle. Here is where Joshua is thought to have brought down the walls, and so on and so forth. And that's more of a communal association with landscape. I was talking about this several years ago, and there was a Navajo woman in the audience, and she came up afterward and she said, when I talk to my parents in Navajo, I can hear those connections, but it has to be in Navajo, which says something about the very words and the way the words tie us to a particular landscape. You know, we're practically neighbors. If your parents and grandparents started in the Big Belts, it's where my brother-in-law and his sons go elk hunting, and just is very close to home.
Yeah. Well, I just and my own sense of my family is very tied to this landscape, to Montana. You know, and I often wonder, you know, what impact it had, the interplay, you know, because in talking with people who've grown up in other places, I see at times the landscape coming through in my own sort of ideology. One of them, for example, is you talked about in your book, just wandering out in the country, just wandering out. And that's not something you can do in a big city. Not, it's just to wander. And I think that has, sort of been built into my character almost, that desire to just go wandering, because I could do so much of it when I was a child. I spent many summers with my grandmother in the original Dunrovin, which was in the Belt Mountains. I would be there for 2 and 3 months, and all I did was wander.
Yeah. Well, I think if there's a logistical frame of reference to landscape when it is rural landscape, and that it affects the way we can act our lives out. I mean, seriously, if you're 60 miles from the nearest grocery store, your life changes to accommodate that fact. I think wandering in cities happens, but it happens in the urban sense of traversing into neighborhoods that are unfamiliar, or exploring in a way that you're exploring in an urban environment. When you're by yourself and you can look around at a 360-degree horizon, which is where I came from, probably less in the mountains where y'all are from.
Right.
There comes to it.
Mary, what the real question is, would your family, this wonderful family, have been an entirely different family if they had stayed in Pennsylvania instead of coming to Montana?
Some of the family did stay in Pennsylvania, and they strike me, the ones that I have known, they strike me as quite different in their outlook, quite different in their interests, quite different in their lifestyles. In many ways, they seem more more homogenized in a sense. More. Well,
I would understand that. Yeah.
And you'll love this, Diane. Several years ago, I had a student who said to me, "Well, you're from Montana, and that's glamorous. You have lots to write about. I'm just from New Jersey, and I have nothing to write about." And,
I understand that, actually.
No, I think sometimes that landscape has it's as though we're imprinted in some way. The way they say ducklings imprint themselves in the first thing they see after they're hatched. That there is that about a certain landscape that we see at some impressionable stage, and that always becomes somehow a part of us, even if we turn our backs on it, even if we don't live there anymore. And I can cite plenty of passages from novelists of the West, of characters who are called back or who never forget a particular landscape.
Sometimes it comes down to the character that you were at that time, when you're looking at the evolution of a human through life. You look back at the person you were then, and you kind of hold your hand up and you're trying to describe their life, and it's like, I am her, or she is me, but I'm no longer her. And so, it's this kind of narrative distance that we have to affect to write good memoir, is that of being able to reach back and effectively reconstruct the life of the character we were then, but still tell it in sort of a narrative, with a good narrative style, which is, I think, what, Mary's book is all about. I teach it as a nonfiction writer to students as a way, how you approach the difficult stories. The braided narrative, Mary, is so excellent. The Unwanted Child has been how many times republished? In the hundreds, if not thousands of times. This is just an absolute marvel of a braided or segmented essay. Just stylistically, I could read the book again and again.
Did you just reread the book?
Yes,
You did.
I did. It was so fun.
Yes. That's part of the magic of books, too, is you get to go back, and it is a different book because you're a different person this time.
It's true. The first time I read this book, I had read it after Lambing Out, which Lambing Out scared me because it spoke of my people so closely that I felt nervous about it. No, I had been in school for 2 years. I had never read anything that came close to a woman from Montana's experience. I was reading, yellow wallpaper, close, but, no cigar. I don't know, all the women leaped off cliffs or ran into the ocean or something happened to them. Anyway, when I got to Mary's stories, it was like, oh my God, it was kind of like writing poetry and having Paul Zarzinski, the cowboy poet, as my teacher, and it normalized my experience. And reading All But the Waltz, when we got to All But the Waltz, it gave me permission to write about my family and about my place, honestly, to just put it out there and see what happened.
I just found so much to celebrate in your book, Mary. Little instances of somebody taking home a child for several years because of difficulties in the family. I have family members who were taken home for 8 years, before the families could come back together. And I always thought of that as sort of strange, but it really helped me understand some of the context of my own family, to recognize that this was, first of all, the economic situation, the background against which these families were trying to survive.
Yes.
And as a child, you don't think of that. You don't, somehow that just doesn't enter into the conversation. And it made me really go back to my own family and think about, now I get this, because this was the time that this was happening in the country. Putting that in historical context really explains a lot. Difference. It does. It just resonated so clearly to me.
Yeah, you're speaking of the child that my grandmother took in when her mother was so sick.
Yes.
Yeah, and my aunts have told me several times that they all cried when her mother came and got well enough to come and get her.
Yeah.
Because they all missed her so much. But again, the context changes, and the impulse sometimes remains the same. Judy knows this. I raised a foster daughter. They took her in when she was 14 and kept her all through high school, and she is still my daughter. Her children call me Grandma. Mm-hmm. Very different circumstances, but with the same kind of bond.
My mother married my father, was her second marriage. She had a 4-year-old daughter, and by the time my sister was old enough to go to school, my mother had 4 children under 4 at home, and they had no 4-wheel drive. And so my sister at age 6, 7 maybe, was sent to live with the school teacher during the school year. Sometimes they could come and get her on the weekends, sometimes not. But she was pretty much boarded out. Yeah. And she recalls that particular family as being kind of a respite, because our home was chaotic, 500 square feet of babies and diapers and no electricity. And the teacher lived in better circumstances. She was the one that kind of wept when she had to come home.
Yeah. I mean, but I do have aunts and uncles that spent time, and my Aunt Betty, I mean, she spent much of her childhood outside the family.
Right. Trading cousins wasn't all that unusual.
Yeah.
The brothers and sisters shunting kids one direction or another due to illness or the birth of another child.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays,
well, Mary, we were all learned something from your book, and that was that marriage was not the only way out, that the teachers were so important and so central, and it made me smile all the way through your book, how important that particular profession was.
Mm-hmm.
for women.
Yeah, and they had very few choices as to gainful employment outside of marriage. There just were very few things that they could do. But one thing they could do was get a certificate and teach in those little rural schools, which were everywhere at that time. And another case of the changing landscape. Very few remain. But at that time, there was one about every 10 or 15 miles.
I was going to say 20 out where I came from, but
was to have a school where every child could walk or at least ride horseback.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But your family did seem to have a commitment, Mary, a kind of which was, I would think, unusual, towards women getting that degree so that they could become teachers.
Well, that was my grandmother. Both my grandmothers were teachers, and they both were. They both came from circumstances where they had to work. They knew they would have to work. And my father's mother told of boarding and working for her board and room while she went to normal school in Philadelphia and scrubbing floors with a spelling book propped up against the bucket to learn her spelling. And then she in her turn drilled me in spelling and drilled me in the multiplication tables and tried to teach me something about Cortez and De Leon and Coronado and other people I wasn't interested in. And it was and she had taught in Philadelphia and had come out west in part because she could live with an uncle and teach in a rural school. And then she met my grandfather, who was her first cousin. My mother's mother had lost her husband early and had taught all over central Montana, a couple years here, a couple years there. And she was determined to give her daughters that little bit of independence, and she managed to get them all 2 years of normal school, which was all it took in those days to get a teaching certificate. My mother taught until she got married. My oldest aunt taught till she got married. My favorite aunt taught all her life until retirement.
Honestly,
and that's what they envisioned. That's what they envisioned for me.
For the country girls,
I didn't stop.
Yeah, you did. For country girls,
most everybody's bewilderment.
Where I come from, the country girls, that was the only outside female influence was the teachers.
Mm-hmm.
We saw, people, mostly guys, come through, and every guy's GUISE, whatever. But the only women that we saw in a professional role were the teachers. Mm-hmm. And so it was an incredibly important role for young ranch girls.
I think too in ranch culture it was okay for a girl to be bookish, but a little suspect for a boy to be bookish. And my life was really strongly affected because I had no brothers. I was one of the oldest of three sisters, and my father treated us like boys and put us to work like boys, and I didn't realize how unusual that was until I later met ranch girls who did have brothers and they were expected to work indoors and in the garden, and their brothers did the kind of work I'd been brought up doing.
Right.
And I've always thought that was just no bad thing, to be brought up to think you could stack hay bales and drive a tractor and break horses and do all the brand calves. It was no bad background for graduate school.
No. I agree.
Well, there was one of the questions I kind of wanted to ask you two to discuss. Both of you are writers, and both of you teach writing. And one of the questions that had come up in our chats was, what about this transition within your own careers from writing for yourself to teaching others to write?
Well, let me start. I don't have an MFA in creative writing. I don't have an MFA. I have a traditional PhD with an emphasis in Renaissance drama. And my idea coming out of graduate school was that I would have a teaching position somewhere where I would teach Shakespeare and other Renaissance writers and would write critical and theoretical essays on Renaissance literature, and that would be my career. And what happened was that I came out of graduate school just as the just as the job market for PhDs in the humanities completely collapsed. And I took what I thought was the last job in the world, and may have been, which was at Northern Montana College as a professor of English, and found myself, for one thing, teaching everything that came along. Children's literature, if they needed that, methods of teaching English, which was a laugh since I didn't know anything about it. And I was miles from a research library. In those days, interlibrary loan was the best you can do. My gosh, if I'd had EBSCO, who knows what I might have done. And so what I did was to start writing fiction again and publishing it, and eventually was hired in Idaho to teach Shakespeare, as a bonus, they thought I could teach creative writing. And I had to teach myself how to teach writing. It was a real strain to go from a literature class where I pretty much knew what I was doing into, of all things, a creative nonfiction workshop where I had no idea in the world what I was doing. And in those days, there weren't even many craft books that to help you out. You know, you constantly get craft books on poetry and fiction and drama shoved at you in hopes that you'll require your students to buy them. But I didn't have that kind of guidance, and I just had to make it up as I went along. And I had a real steep learning curve.
Judy?
Well, I came to it, I didn't get a start until I started my undergraduate career in my 30s. And so, I just turned 60, and I keep thinking I'm just underway. My career is just beginning, sort of. But now it's gotten so difficult in the realm of MFA programs is so huge. They've got the low residential programs and the online programs, and it becomes a bit of a trial. In my case, I find I spend far more time teaching than I do writing, and that's, I guess, a product of how I came to be a self-employed person, got my kids all kind of launched, but I spent all of my time and effort and stuff leading up to that sort of devoted to getting them out of the nest. And when I turned around and suddenly had to make reparations of, retirement and all this stuff, I was in my 50s, and I had 2 years of retirement built up. So it comes down to practicality in my sense. I do a lot of my own writing now in response to requests. People will jab me and give me an assignment, and I will write. But I spend less and less time as something springing from my own heart to sit down at the computer for one more hour, and I spend so much time at the computer doing other people's work. It's so I look forward to retirement. I really do, Mary. I don't know if I ever get to, but I'd like that option.
Well, Mackenzie, are you there? Do we have any comments or questions from the people on the chat? Are you with us, Mackenzie? Keeping an eye on the chat?
I am here, but Diane was going to field those, I thought.
Oh, good.
Do you want me to,
Okay.
Diane?
I didn't see any questions, though.
We got one
It said,
from Celia.
yes, we do. What happened to Auntie Imogene?
She ended up her teaching career in Port Angeles, Washington, where she taught 7th grade math, and one of her students was Tess Gallagher. And she went on living in Port Angeles until about the age of 80, when something profound happened, probably a series of small, almost certainly unrecognizable strokes. And I was the closest to her. I was living in Lewiston, Idaho at that time, and I had seen her at Thanksgiving, and she seemed fine, but at Christmas something was wrong, and ultimately, my daughters and I went out to Port Angeles, and we moved her back to Lewiston and moved her into a house of her own, where she lasted for about 2 years, and then only because one of my daughters moved in with her. And she had been able to function in Port Angeles, find the bank and so forth, in a strange place. She never drove again. Her mind, her day-to-day short-term memory just disintegrated. And she had to go into a nursing home. We called it the Villa Kula because it was actually the Villa something or other, and my youngest daughter was reading Pippi Longstocking at the time. And I was the number one person to take care of her. I ultimately wrote a memoir about the experience. It's called Balsam Root. It's on the recommended list for reading for people who are dealing with relatives with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. It was a very sad thing for all of us to witness, and fortunately for her, it moved quite rapidly. But even at a time when her short-term memory was such that she didn't know whether she'd had lunch or what she'd had for lunch, I could get her talking about the past, and it was like time travel. And she remembered the time she cut her foot in the mowing machine accident. She could tell me who the doctor was and what he did, who else was on the ward, that it was the 4th of July, and she hobbled to the window to look out to see part of the parade. It was as though I was somehow in the presence of somebody in 1942, and it was an amazing experience. But she died in about 1993, I think it was. And
she was one of our favorite characters, I have to tell you, out of your whole book. She was very memorable.
Yeah. Oh, she was a wonderful woman. She was a wonderful woman. She was everybody's favorite aunt. Pardon?
Did she ever marry?
No, never did. In Balsam Root, I write about, I think I tracked down a love affair. And there was a young cowboy, and nobody had any money, and he owned his saddle and the clothes he stood up in, and he stole something and was sent to the state prison in Deer Lodge for a couple of years, which broke her heart, and I don't think she ever looked at anybody else. Years later, a young historian in Montana looked up his prison record for me, showed me his, the photograph they took when he was admitted, and the physical record. His teeth were bad, which speaks to a depression-age kid. And as far as I can tell, she never had another romantic involvement.
Wow.
Well, I want to thank you, Mary. This has just been so pleasurable. I really appreciate all the efforts you've put into getting connected with us, working with Mackenzie last week to make the connection a solid one.
Oh, and we have one more question here.
Oh, good.
I just looked back at the chat, and there was another question. What is a diamond oak?
Oh, a diamond willow, by any chance? I don't know anything about a diamond oak, but there is such a tree as a diamond willow.
Okay.
There are several species of willows that you'll find in Montana, and one is the golden willow. And in fact, they grow in my backyard here in Idaho, along creek beds, and they're named for their golden twigs and whips. A diamond willow is more of a dry land willow, and the bark will form diamond-shaped patches as the tree grows. And that reader probably noticed my writing about my father riding through a landscape and referring to an old diamond willow.
Thank you.
Diamond willows were made into fence posts because they were so hard and so, resilient. They were also made into walking canes.
That's how I remember them, as walking canes.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions, Diane?
We have one that said, and this was brought up a while ago, why was the name of the book All But the Waltz?
That was the title I gave to the final essay in the book about my husband's death, and it had to do with the way I felt about. I basically felt like I abandoned him. you know, in my head, I know I had few choices. He was irrational. He was making threats. He was potentially violent, and I had a 5-year-old to take care of and raise, and so I left him to die on his own. And I, to this day, feel as though that was a betrayal in my heart. And it was my sense that I had stuck with him until the last waltz, all but the waltz.
Yeah.
That just had to do with that final essay. And I think that I originally called the story, the collection, Leaving Montana, and my editor didn't like it. And one thing you can count on in publishing is no editor likes any title. And if the and no marketing board likes it. They want to know where to put the book on the shelf. And so he suggested All But the Waltz, and I said okay. And I don't know that told anybody where to put it on the shelf, but that's the story behind the title.
Actually, what happened is we spent a lot of the book wondering what the title meant, which of course didn't come clear to us until the end of the book, when it was clear.
Well, and I have a weakness for country music, and playing in my head was Save the Last Waltz for me.
Yeah.
And I didn't.
There's also at a country dance, the very last dance is always a waltz.
Yeah.
And so there's that end of All But the Waltz means that you stay for everything until the very last song.
And I think to the extent it reflects the whole book, it is that I really turned my back on a certain way of life.
True.
And I went off to graduate school and did what nobody in my family ever understood, and became a professor, about whom my mother never used the words professor without absent-minded professor. It's not as a qualifier, but as
No.
as a characteristic of the profession. And I separated myself from a certain way of life.
Professor.
Mine, the 3 syllables. Professor. Damn professors.
Yes.
Ever hear anything about an educated fool, Judy?
Yeah. Yeah, all that book learning. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Mary.
Well, thank you very much. It's very pleasurable. I feel as though I've had a long chat with an old friend and 2 new ones.
Well, that's great. Thank you, everyone on chat. And before we leave, it is my birthday, and I know that my husband has a special cake for me because James, come over here, James. You got to get behind us here. This is our tech guy here. This was the cat on the couch. Okay.
Yeah, I'm the cat on the couch.
He's the cat on the couch. And his wife is this incredible artist, and she made me this wonderful cake.
Oh,
and
look at that.
yeah, so we have to show it to viewers here.
Where's our camera?
Well, it's right here.
All right, so let's pick it up if we can. Yeah. And people in
Oh my!
And who are these, Diane? You'll recognize these 2
Oh,
characters.
it's Maud and Gertie. It's the most wonderful divas in the world.
And let me tell you, Mary, Miss Gertie's named after my grandmother from Belt, Montana, Gertrude, and after her younger sister, Maud. And I think they'd be really happy to have donkeys named after them, frankly.
They're the local donkeys at the ranch.
Local donkeys at the ranch. They're our mascots. At any rate, thank you all, and I'll say good night. And we're going to have some cake, and I wish you were all here to join us. Good night.
Well, happy birthday, and happy to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Good night, all.
Good night, all. Wow, this is nice. We're going to have something to drink with the cake.
Yeah.